Okay, so this is a video that's going to cover the topic of monopsony. Monopsony, you might think it sounds like it's a play on the word monopoly, and it is. Monopoly is the term we use to describe a case of a single seller in a market. Monopsony is the case of a single buyer in a market. Most frequently, this monopsony would arise probably in an input market. And this is the same example that I had in my notes that I have for chapter 13. And just as one that sort of occurs to me, I mean, suppose you look at the market for astronauts. Well, if you're an astronaut, you pretty much have to work for NASA. I know there's SpaceX now, it may be some other place, but historically you'd have to work for NASA. So you have a single buyer of labor, of a highly specialized type of labor. You have only one employer. And that's going to mean that we have to draw, when we want to figure out what the equilibrium in this labor market is going to be, we're going to have to do things a little bit differently, just as we had to for monopoly. Monopoly, because there was a single buyer, we know we had to adjust, in effect, the demand. We had to come up with a marginal revenue curve that differed from the demand curve because the monopolist, as the sole seller of the good, would have to take into account the effect of lowering the price on the units that they were already selling. So the monopolist has to lower their price to sell more of the good, and they would take into account in terms of the revenue the fact that if they were already selling 100 units and they wanted to sell 110 units, well, cutting the price to sell those 100 extra 10 units means you have to cut the price that you were selling the first 100 units for. We have a similar type of thing here for on the buying side when you're, say, hiring labor. So we have a demand curve. This would be the firm's demand for labor, given their isoquants and their production function and the amount of output that they want to hire, they want to produce. That gives us the firm's demand for labor, and then we also have a supply curve. The supply curve here would be the number of workers who would be wanting to work. In this case, I just have made up some numbers here. So suppose if NASA was going to pay a salary of $50,000, there'd be one qualified astronaut who'd be willing to work for them. And then to hire more and more astronauts, they have to increase the salary. So there's just some made up numbers, but we're going to use some concrete numbers here to illustrate the fact. Now, and then what we're going to do is we're going to add something in here that we're calling marginal expenditure. So if we say, like, well, what happens to the total wage bill, the total amount that our single buyer has to pay as they increase the salary, or as they try to hire additional workers. So for the first worker, there's no difference here. If you go from hiring 0 workers to 1 worker, you have to pay whatever the supply curve has. So your marginal expenditure is going to be $50,000. But suppose you want to hire a second worker. You have to raise the salary from $50,000 to $60,000. And one of the things we're assuming here, it's mentioned in the book, it's important to highlight it. What we're assuming is that if this employer is going to hire multiple workers, they have to pay all the workers, since they're sort of the same here in this market, they have to pay all the workers the same salary, which is what we would get here when if we were to look at the equilibrium, where equilibrium assumes that everybody's getting the same salary. So if you assume that the seller has, or that the employer here has to pay the same salary to all these workers, then what we can see is that as they go from hiring 1 astronaut to 2, we know that to get a second qualified person to work as an astronaut, they have to bump the salary up to $60,000. But if we say, how much extra does NASA have to spend in terms of their wage bill, all of their salaries for astronauts as they go from hiring 1 astronaut to 2, well, it's not $60,000. $60,000 is what they have to pay the second astronaut. They had to up the salary of their first astronaut from $50,000 to $60,000. So if we think about it, they actually spend $70,000 to hire that second astronaut, $60,000 to hire the second qualified astronaut and the salary they pay them, and then the extra $10,000 that they had to boost up the salary of the first person they would have been able to hire at $50,000 a year. So then if we go from there, we want to hire a third astronaut. Well, they'd have to pay $70,000. They have to have salary of $70,000 a year to get 3 qualified astronauts to work for them. But if we think about how much their labor expense goes up when they hire a third astronaut, it's not $70,000 because that's what they're paying the third astronaut. It would actually be $70,000 plus. Well, we're already hiring 2 workers at $60,000. They have to boost their salaries each by $10,000. So the marginal expenditure will be $90,000, and so forth here. So it'd be 110 here. So what we can see is that the marginal expenditure is greater. Is greater than the salary. If we were thinking about graphing this marginal expenditure curve, well, the first 2 columns here is a supply curve. So that's the supply curve. So we see what we have drawn here, and I didn't draw it exactly here, but what we have here is the supply curve. And since the marginal expenditure is greater than the supply curve, there would be a marginal expenditure curve, and when we go to graph it, it would lie above the supply curve. And if you look at the difference here, the difference in any given quantity is actually getting bigger. So the first quantity, they're going to be the same, and then they're diverging. So if we continue this supply curve over here to the axis, when we go to graph the marginal expenditure curve, it would look something like this. And again, that's marginal expenditure. So you see that there's something that's at least somewhat parallel in what we had with Monopoly. On the Monopoly side, we had the marginal revenue, and that was a deviation from the demand curve. And that should make, hopefully you see, like, okay, you have a single seller, so they're looking at demand, the other side of the market, differently. Here you have monopsony, they're a single buyer, so they're looking at the other side of the market, the supply side, differently. You have a marginal expenditure curve that deviates from the supply curve. In this case, it deviates by being above the supply curve. Now, once we have this marginal expenditure curve, in our single buyer, our monopsonist, wouldn't look at the supply curve, they would look at the marginal expenditure curve. And they would end up they would compare their marginal expenditure with their demand, which would be the value of their marginal product. And so the firm would want to hire labor up until the point in which the value of their marginal product is just equal to the marginal expenditure. And so the value of the marginal product rule that we have at the start of chapter 13 gets modified here in the case of a monopsonist. But the equilibrium, or the amount of labor that would be hired, would be here. It would be L1 would be the quantity of labor that the monopsonist would want to hire. The salary, well, for the salary we have to go off of the supply curve. The salary would come off of the supply curve, and so this would be the wage or the salary that they would pay. And then what we see up here is that what would be the marginal revenue product, or the value of the marginal product. I'm sorry. So let me just rewrite this here, because they use MVP in the book. So MVP would be at this level. So the monopsonist would want to hire labor up until the point that their the value of the marginal product is equal to the marginal expenditure. That occurs here. That gives us the quantity of labor they want to hire. And then to get the wage, we simply get that off of the supply curve. And so that would be the case of a monopsonist. We almost never do very much with monopsony in economics. It's important we mention it here. It does show up in like labor economics or sports economics, particularly the sports economics, because you have sports leagues are in many cases the only buyer or the only buyer of some very specialized talent. So, like for instance, the National Football League is the only real place that you, if you're a top flight football player, that's the only place you really can play in the world would be the NFL. There's the Canadian Football League, the XFL, I guess, just went out of business. Um, there are some other leagues, but the NFL is basically the only game in town, and they would be, if you think of the league as a whole, they would be a monopsonist. They're the only buyer of uh, I guess, high quality American football players. And so that ends up being in sports economics. Monopsony is an important concept we use there. And there's a lot of the history of sports bargaining that really represents ways in which the leagues have tried to extract some of the rents from players, or in effect benefit the leagues at the expense of the players. But monopsony is similar to monopoly, but just a single buyer of a good. And again, most often this would show up probably in a labor market. So that's the model of monopsony.